Certainly, when it comes to human rights and globalization, Islam is up front and center, and it's often in a negative way. But at the same time, as I think we'll see from these presentations, we have a lot of ignorance about what's going on the ground in terms of Islam and human rights, in both its religious dimension, but also in terms of Muslim political movements. We have a lot of ignorance of the reality, and therefore we're a little bit short on what the possibilities are. One important question I think for us to consider as we listen to these presentations is, how do we understand Islam as a group identity in a political sense that sets itself against other identities, other groups, or as a religious consciousness with a organic vision of its own. Anyways, I think these three papers will help us to think more profoundly about the place of Islam in global realities. We have three wonderful speakers, Yvonne Haddad, Riva Castellano, and Bob Hefner. Yvonne is a professor of history of Islam and Christian-Muslim relations at the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown, and she's a leading expert on women in Islam, and she has published numerous publications on Islam in America, on Islamic fundamentalism, Sayyid Qutb, for example, as well as on women in Islam. Riva Castellano, she comes to us from Paris. She's a senior research fellow at the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. Her work addresses the transnational uses of religion and ethnicity in Europe and other democratic societies. She's also got valuable publications on state and minorities and negotiating identity and formation of identity, religious minorities, especially in the European context. And finally, Bob Hefner is coming to us. He's professor of anthropology and associate director of the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs at Boston University. And his research centers on religion and politics in Southeast Asia. He has made some very valuable contributions on democracy in Indonesia and concepts of civil society in the Islamic context. And so, following the precedents set this morning, and of course precedent, sunnah is very important in Islam, we'll just go one after another. The three panelists will all speak for 10 to 12 minutes, and then I'll have some comments, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So, Riva, if you would like to begin, Riva will speak to us on the politicization of Islam in Europe, human rights, and the politics of recognition.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you also, Tom, for inviting me to this very interesting conference. And you made me think in terms of human rights. And I had to put in every paragraph something about human rights. And looked about the European Convention of Human Rights to see what they said about this banning this card. And the discourse, I did already the discourses of my activists about the human rights. But here I would like to present I would like to structure my presentation in two parts. And one would be the state and religion, the state and immigration relationship, and the second part will be the transnational aspect. In the state and religion, or the state of immigration, we are talking here, of course, about the Muslim immigrants in Europe, and mainly in France. France has been mentioned many times last night, this morning, about secularism, and the secularism against the human rights was said last night by Kenneth Roth, and this morning the comparison between French secularism and American secularism has been mentioned by Alfred Stepan. And I won't discuss the French secularism, but I want to show what is at stake with the French secularism and with the integration of Muslims in the He puts the pressure on time, and then I get first. Thank you. So, since the 80s, Islam has become a real political force in Europe. In the political, what I mean by political force is the way they put pressure on states for recognition. Actually, it shouldn't be a state pressure, but the states were not ready how to recognize Islam in terms of culture, in terms of religion, and in what terms, in terms of human rights also at the same time. And the second aspect will deal much more with the Islam is a transnational force, bringing a new kind of power relationship with the states and nourished by external events and changing all the sense of belonging and allegiance to a more global nation that finds a comfort in the basis of Islam than in the context of the state and assimilation. Of course, religion challenges democratic states, Islam challenges democratic states to their approach to diversity and multiculturalism. But the secular state now is under pressure either to reorganize its institutions in order to include Islam into its institutions, or to provide a different kind of understanding of religion or diversity, of religious diversity. At stake is, for a democratic state like France, how can Muslims be integrated into the political community? How can common membership be promoted and the common civic culture defined that allows citizens to find adequate identification and ascribe Islam as a part of European historical continuity, I would say. And the second aspect, as I said, is this transnational. For the first aspect, I will be very short because I took the case of the scarf and show how the scarf issue, the headscarf issue in France has mobilized the whole political class and brought Islam at the core of a reappropriation of identity of Muslim immigrants, and also religion in the core of the debate, defining laïcité, French secularism. Something that, a concept that was going without saying, suddenly had to be defined with regard to Muslim immigration and the recognition of Islam. So what is interesting here is that all this process has changed the concept of ethnicity that was at the core of multiculturalism and diversity into religious terms. Because the only way you can recognize the only way the secular state to recognize a diversity, religious diversity, has become institutional within the secularist definition of institutional definition of secularism, since secularism is much more, has become in practice a religious and institutional arrangements and institutional accommodation. So it has been, so this aspect gave a sort of legitimacy to religion, taking in a country where multiculturalism is a core of tension, that's Republican ideology, and it took out this concept of ethnicity into religion in order to find a recognition in the institutional setting, which is sort of contradictory with the understanding of laïcité, then with the cleavages that brought the cleavage into religious terms rather than on ethnic terms. Actually, I thought of that by reading the title of your paper on ethnicization of Islam, and suddenly I see religialization of an ethnic identity in France. And this is actually one aspect of the definition. For me, it was an equal to put Islam in equal footing with other religions, because the organization of secularism in France in the 100 years, even since Napoleon, was an institutional representation of religions. If this is the equality, it's on the institutional level, so the idea is to bring also Islam on the same idea of representation of other religions. In some ways, which is for me, and I define this as institutional assimilation, which will bring a bigger identification with the state. And of course, I understand, with this purpose, I'm not talking about the scarf, but the issue is how this identification brought a bigger tension in the society, and how the only solution has become, of course, the scarf. But the scarf is the religious institutional representation. Of course, it's not the normative reaction to this is when other institutions such as school, labor market are not fulfilling their role, is an institutional representation enough to come to equality. But at the same time, if religion appears as a main cleavage in the society, then I would say maybe its recognition can be seen as a path towards an institutional assimilation that I would defend. But and I would defend even more this institutional assimilation as a post-multicultural approach, that it can encourage religion to develop within democratic liberal institutions and help them to break free of external forces their countries of origin, international organizations, seeking to promote Islam in Europe. So this can be, and then to develop an idea of Ummah in Europe, or reimagined Ummah in Europe. Such a Ummah could become a non-territorial nation. This is my second argument. And people's sense of belonging, it would be constructed under external influences over which states would not have any control. So the second aspect of my paper is this effect of transnationalism. Of course, we have many external effects, international events that affect and nourishes this belonging beyond territory, and that touches much more Islam than in the last 20 years than any other religion, and that brings the global consciousness beyond only Islamic identity, and takes the question of ethnicity and minority beyond the relationship with the state. So, and then I developed this idea by arguing that the new trend is getting based on the transnational communities based on solidarity and bringing the home country into this solidarity leads to another understanding maybe of nationalism, is the hypothesis that I try to develop, and that I call transnational nationalism. Why nationalism we can discuss later. But as, of course we cannot talk about one Islam. There's no one Muslim group. They are as diverse, Muslims are as diverse as Christians, and in language, nationality, ethnicity, and even in domination. Add to that political ideologies. So how can you re-centralize all these different elements into one being, into one identification, being Muslim in Europe, and call it a transnational nationalism? There, I will develop two approaches, I mean very briefly, of course. The first approach is not institutional, but the values that are diffused by supranational institutions and human rights institutions, and that through the process which is they give the legitimacy to a diversity on the international stage, and via transnational networks by developing also an inclusive discourse founded on human rights, the fight against racism and other forms of social and political cultural exclusion, etc. Such normative values are imposed on states and find also an echo in claims for equality among immigrants, Muslim immigrants population, for recognition and respect, and gives to particularities an universal view, an universal basis. The second aspect of this re-centralization of this Muslim diversity into one is around a common identity. It refers to a retranslation of a Ummah into a transnational nation, and it gets its legitimacy by being a minority, first in Europe, and then getting a non-European minority in Europe, and that their demands for recognition this idea of belonging to one identity, non-European identity in Europe, is nourished by international organizations, the home country. Even the home country sometimes are in contradiction with this development, but they all develop and nourish the loyalty of the Muslim population residing in different European countries. Their strategy, even if they seem contradictory, they find a basis on supranational recognition and of the international organizations, and the way they rise above the national cleavages of Muslims in Europe in order to create one single identification. So this comes to the idea of homogenizing in Islam as in minority situations. And we talked about the actors, the role of the actors, transnational actors in this situation is how they take over all the Western human rights discourse for equality, against racism, etc., and lead the loyalty towards their understanding of group and minority and nation in order to express the mistrust to the nation state. So such re-centralizations of identity are not territorial. The rhetoric of mobilization re-centralizes in a non-territorial way the multiplicities of identities, national, religious, ethnic, linguistic, and that are fragmented and yet represented in such a structure. Together they come to a understanding of a new nationalism that I call transnational nationalism. And that is a nationalism that has not a territorial claim, and that is based and developed beyond and outside the borders of the state and its territory. And it has two functions. One, it returns to the state of origin, to the home country, to define a new understanding of nationalism that is much more based on religion. I'm talking about Muslim societies mainly. And the second is that it creates new expression of belonging and a political engagement that reflects to the nationalization of communitarian feelings and guided by an imagined geography. We can talk about pan-Islam, pan-religiosity, or ummah, community of religious, just reinterpreted, reframed, reframing all internal diversity into an imagined community which loses in some ways its religious content in order to define itself as a single cultural nation, giving rise to a nationalism which defines itself much more on cultural nationalism than as ideological state nationalism. I think I would leave this, just another word on Islam, to why this model is based after my research on Islam. Of course, the politicized modes of organization in Islam concern only one infinitesimal part of the Muslim population in Europe. But Islamic associations play altogether a larger role in the development of ethnic pride, a sense of community whose attributes are drawn out of Islam, essentially creating out of Islam the boundaries of a moral community. The discourse is based on justice, equality, dignity, respect of particularism, on universal human values. But to conclude, I think he will write 1 minute in very soon. To conclude, I would say that this kind of nation that is cultural nationalism and not beyond, and not what we are used to this state nationalism, to what extent it raises the same kind of human rights issue that has been discussed here since last night, and what kind of democracy can be developed in this kind of understanding of nation, and what kind of international justice can take into consideration this development. Thank you.
From Yvonne Haddad on gender jihad, the quest to ground human rights within Islam.
This is part of an ongoing research. If any of you want to hear the rest of my paper, it will be posted, but I'm going to deviate a little bit from the paper, basically because I need to ground it in an international context. A lot of what happens on the ground in the Muslim world is a reaction to international, or the perception of international relations. And women's right is part and parcel of the encounter with the West. It is not something that sort of came from within. It wasn't something that generated from within, but it was imposed from the outside. There are at least 3 different areas that we can look at it, and it is more than that, but I want to ground into 3 parts. First is a reaction to colonialism. The second is the Cold War, where Muslim nations found themselves competing for acceptance from either the Soviet Union or the Western countries. And the third is the unipolar American hegemony over the Muslim world. And these 3 things have, 3 areas of encounter have had a great impact on the role of women, and you can see it in historical developments and what kind of organizations we have. At the beginning, under colonialism, there was missionaries and colonial leaders who came in and said, you stupid Muslims, you'll never amount to anything unless you sort of accept our Christianity and become as wonderful as we are and change your women. So you get people who begin to write about changing the role of women. We have the invention of the sort of the new woman, a book written by Qasim Amin at the beginning of the 20th century, in which he defines the role of this woman who is going to be the perfect wife for the new modern man that is going to be created in Egypt. and she's going to be this wonderful mother of his children so that they can create a modern state. So from the beginning, the liberation of women was very involved in the liberation of society from colonialism. And if we don't see it that way, we don't realize that we cannot have liberation of women without the liberation of men. And I've talked to a lot of women who are in the liberation movement, and they say, our men can't vote, so how can we insist on voting? Because we have autocratic governments. Our men aren't free to decide the future of our country. So what are we talking about? So unless we can liberate the whole society, then we can ask for our own agenda. But the discourse of human rights has taken hold. And when I accepted to do the paper, I had done some work on the first two parts up to the 1990s, and I did not realize how the discourse has expanded. I have looked at over 100 books and articles on the topic, and I haven't finished reading all of them, and I'm amazed at the amount of literature that has been produced on the idea of liberation, both in Muslim countries and as Muslim women. Now, what is interesting is that you see that the West has a stereotype of what the Muslim woman is. When we went to war in Afghanistan, President Bush justified the war. We're going to liberate the women of Afghanistan. This was nothing new because the war against the Barbary state was justified. We were going to liberate the women of the Barbary states, and we were going to liberate them and give them democracy because they lived under autocratic rules. So these are perceived as excuses for intervention. So in the geopolitical, in the more international realm, women's rights is seen as part of intrusion, part of subverting the nation state. But at the same time, there's a stereotype in the West of what the Muslim woman is, and there's a lot of literature that has developed that Muslim women in the U.S. have worked on. And basically, you have harems, women who are lounging around, basically lusting, spending the whole day getting sexually attractive or indulged in sex. And there is a little video on Hollywood harems, which has sort of clippings from a variety of movies and how the West has depicted Muslim women. And they have too much sex. And if you look at the writings of the missionaries, that's what they condemned them about. They spend too much time on sex. Now what has happened is after the Afghan war, we think that they have not enough sex because we want them to get recovered, we want them to seek liberation. And so what has happened is that they're still the other. They're still different, they're still lesser than we are. But our idea of who they should be has changed because we have changed in the West. Now, for each stereotype that the West has developed, the Muslims have produced a prototype about how wonderful Muslim women are. And you will see that, and they have bragging rights about it. And basically, Islam gave women the right to live, the right to be educated, the right to inherit. Way before the Swiss gave that right. And they own business, they transact business, they keep their own money. And then in the 1960s, you had the feminist movement in the United States, and they started talking about women wanting to keep their maiden name, and so the bragging right, Muslims were the first to allow the Muslim women to keep her name. And then the women in the West wanted orgasm, and they said, yeah, but in Islam, and the Prophet said that, don't approach women like animals, and so on and so forth. The bragging rights are for satisfaction of sex for women. And so the stereotype and the prototype are always changing. And they're changing because they talk to each other, and they respond to each other depending on what the discourse is. One is demonizing, and the other is saying, oh, no, we are okay. The thing that we have to keep in mind is that during the colonial period, women's participation in the liberation movement is very important in liberating them, bringing them out. 1919, there were women in Cairo, in Jerusalem, and Damascus. They marched against the Versailles Treaty. They marched against having their countries occupied. We had women, Christian women going to the Al-Azhar and preaching, Christian women preaching in Haram Sharif in Jerusalem, Muslim women preaching in churches, and basically they were working together For women's liberation, yeah, but mostly for the liberation from occupation. We have Muslim women and Christian women who fought the occupation forces. The example that mostly you see is in Algeria, but women in Syria and Lebanon and some other places have actually fought for liberation. So that liberation of the nation preempts the liberation of women, and that's very important to keep in mind. The other question is liberation from what to what? And if you look at the material that the colonial and the colonial bureaucrats and the missionaries wanted, they wanted to liberate them from Islam, basically. And so what had happened is, as a reaction, is we have to maintain our Islamic identity. So the more the attack is on Islam, the more there is this wall of resistance. And what constitutes an Islamic identity? Increasingly, by the 1990s, it becomes the veil or the scarf. And so you begin to have, as you go through the 20th century, you have re-Islamization taking place in the 70s, it increases in the 80s, it increases in the 90s, and of course now it has increased even more, basically in response to foreign relations and political situations. I don't know how many of you know, but people in the Middle East know very, very well that human rights and women's rights are part of American policy, American foreign policy. If you look at the Gerachian speech at the Meridian, they identified priority number 1 is Israel, priority number 2 is oil, and after that, we worked on human rights, minority rights, and women's rights. And so when America again in the 2002-2003 begins to talk about liberating the women of Islam, they're beginning to see it as part of this imposition of international law in order to undermine society. And they talk about Western hypocrisy or American hypocrisy. And all this literature talks about that. And let me give you a little bit about that. And basically, they ask if America is for human rights, why not the Palestinian rights? Okay, America says, well, the Israelis voted, they have democracy. Okay, the Palestinians voted, but we don't like what they chose, and therefore they don't have democracy. And so they talk about this as hypocrisy. Of course, the Algeria situation is another example in which the United States did not recognize people who voted and their choice. Then you have President Bush talking about how wonderful democracy is and it's going to take over the whole world, and Muslims looking to watch. And then what happens is they go and support somebody like the president of Egypt or the king of Saudi Arabia. People who are very autocratic, but they are in our national interest to, we must support them to stay in power regardless of their violation of human rights. Okay. So when they look at this, they also look at what they call the concern index. Do really Americans care about what happens to Muslim women or Arab women? And some of the things they quote, for example, what you have in 1990s when Madeleine Albright was asked on television, Iraqi children and women who are dying of malnutrition, lack of medical supplies in Iraq due to containment. Do you think it's worth it? And they said 500,000 people. And she said, yes, it's worth it. It's unfortunate, but it's worth it. And so what they hear is we really don't care what happens to them. We use human rights as sort of a political stick whenever we find it useful and necessary. More recent speeches by other prominent women in the United States, you have Mrs. Bush, when she was in Paris, she said that she has no empathy for Palestinian women. Mrs. Clinton loved the wall that the Israelis have built. Condoleezza Rice has talked about chaos as very useful tool of government, and chaos brings about horrible situation for women. And the American policy at the moment, as perceived in the Middle East, is that we want a civil war in Palestine, we want Palestinians to start killing each other again, and we want a civil war in Lebanon. And the situation of women under civil war, I know you're MC, I should finish. I didn't finish. I'm sorry, time's up. Ask your question.
Now we hear from Bob Hefner on constitutionalism and democratization in Islam, latent prejudices, and current tensions.
Thank you. The title actually is God's Law Revisited, Human Rights and Democracy in Contemporary Islam. But let me begin by first thanking Tom Banchoff and Bob Lucknow for this invitation. I've met Tom recently, and I know Bob from many years back, but it's always a great pleasure to participate in any event with him, and it's a great pleasure to do so for the first time with Tom. You will notice a small tension in my paper presentation today. When I was invited, I thought I was the only panelist who was going to pretend to speak on the Muslim world. Obviously, either I didn't read the letter of invitation or the letter of invitation didn't lay that out. So I thought, okay, I'll give the broader background. And this broader background to understanding human rights in Islam is one that I happen to be interested in now, not moving away from, but adding to my more anthropological approach to the study of Islam and Muslim politics. What I'll talk about today is both the sort of jurisprudential aspects of the law as regards human rights and democracy, and then I'll also have a few things very quickly to say about the Indonesian case, which I brought in after I received the clarification that I was just one small fish among many much bigger fish, so I better have something local as well as transnational. My paper begins by stating the obvious, which is that, as we all know, of all the major world religions in policy circles today, it's Islam that is most commonly cited as the great exception to the possibility of democracy and constitutionalism. It's the exception that's bitterly argued about in policy circles, but not just as a result of Sam Huntington, but as a result of some Muslim scholars themselves. It's a tension that is much discussed, much under discussion. In 1981, of course, representatives from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and several other countries issued their Universal Islamic Declaration on Human Rights, which also seemed to position at least some segments of the Muslim community as in opposition to international standards, as they are called, and which I think should more properly be called liberal understandings of universal human rights. So it's not just Sam Huntington, it's a number of other influences that Muslim authors who see an incompatibility or inconsistency. But Muslim politics is nothing if not varied, and as I'll suggest today, and as a number of other people have shown, there's lots of other data from other parts of the world that indicates that there's strong support in the Muslim public in particular for constitutionalism and democracy. We have Ronald Inglehart's and Pippo Norris's, I think, very interesting, although still very preliminary study of Islam and democracy, which reveals that in the majority, not all, but the great majority of Muslim countries, there's strong support for democracy. And a more recent study by Muattaz Fakra, somewhat less rigorous, but I think in some ways more interesting because better informed by a better sense of Islam. His study shows great compatibility and great interest in human rights and democracy on the parts of Muslim publics in many parts of the world. But there is, at the very least, no fixed consensus. There wasn't such a fixed consensus in much of the Western world for many decades. We shouldn't be surprised that there isn't in the Muslim world as well. But beneath and beyond the lack of an operating consensus right now, there are certain tropes or themes that appear again and again in debates among Muslims themselves. And it's these that I want to talk briefly about today. The most important of these, of course, has to do with the relationship between the Sharia, Islamic law as it's translated, and human rights and democracy themselves. Muslim proponents of democracy and human rights say that there is no such incompatibility between the Sharia and law, and or they qualify in some other way. And others, indeed many respected jurists, say there is an incompatibility, or at the very least there has to be some type of adjustment. Now, Sharia then becomes a sort of central issue in debates about human rights among Muslims themselves. Sharia is typically translated as Islamic law, but as Berkley Center and other people have shown, it's actually much more of a total and indeed even totalizing discourse that applies to diet and sexual relations, not just ideas of economic justice and political organization. The point I want to begin with, and the first sort of substantive point that I would make on the background of the Sharia, is it's not so much the detail of the Sharia that is critical, but the sort of longing, cultural longing and idealization that it inspires on the part of many Muslims for a social order based on God's commandments, even in the absence of a settled consensus, and there is no settled consensus among Muslims themselves as to precisely what those commandments are. So it's this civilizational longing and legacy, I think, that we see appear again and again over Islamic history. An ideal and a hope for a longing for comprehensiveness in the application of God's law, even in the absence of agreement on its precisely how it should be implemented and what its detail is, in particular as regards things of politics and law. Indeed, as I explained in the paper, it's on matters, ironically, it's on matters of public politics and social organization that indeed the consensus is perhaps weakest. The law is much clearer on matters of diet and prayer, ritual, than it is on matters of government and public order. This fact reflects the historical fact that historically, the historical Sharia, as scholars call it, to distinguish it from the ideal of the Sharia as God's commandments, it took shape as jurisprudence, as fiqh, at the end of the Umayyad and the beginning of the Abbasid period, particularly the Abbasid period is from the 750s to the middle of the 9th century. And this was a time, of course, at which the Abbasid Empire in particular had appropriated Persian styles of government and created a much more powerful and much more comprehensive state than the initial waves of Arab conquest had created. And in response to this somewhat Persianate, but at the very least very powerful state, the jurists who were involved in the formulation of fiqh, of Islamic jurisprudence that is today associated with Sharia, historical Sharia, they actually restricted its scope and sort of were very wary about extending their understanding of the Sharia into matters of government too far. As a result, a second consequence of this sort of wariness in the face of the strong state, rulers themselves actually engaged in the creation of legislation, something which is strict interpretation. Certainly many conservative interpretations of Islamic law today say that cannot be done. The only legislature is God's law. But in fact, there was a good deal of legislation historically. It wasn't called Sharia, and it was kept separate from the fiqh, but it became absolutely vital for the organization of the state. But those rulers' edicts, as they are known, couldn't be integrated into the Sharia, and therefore there was always a kind of latent tension, and more importantly, a theme that I'll strike generally here, there was a kind of lack of integration and accounting for the historical development of Muslim politics. The Sharia stayed more or less an unchanged ideal, whereas, if you will, rulers themselves developed a political culture which was quite dynamic, quite flexible, but again and again not integrated back into the most prestigious of bodies of Islamic knowledge, that is the fiqh or jurisprudence. There was a similar sort of genealogical segregation, as I talk about in the paper, as regards the Mazalim tribunals, which were not Sharia courts. They were courts that, in fact, in most instances, weren't based on Sharia, but they became very, very important in most Muslim states and were based primarily, again, on edicts issued either by the ruler himself and or by functionaries who represented him. Finally, there was a similar ship's passage through the night quality to Muslim political thought as regards these things that in the literature are called mirrors for the princes. These are kinds of manuals, practical manuals for governance that really are quite ingenious, on par philosophically and intellectually with anything that Machiavelli or some other late medieval or early Renaissance figures wrote. They show a very, very savvy effort to learn from history. But once again, because of the idealization of the Sharia, they were integrated into that body of religious knowledge, and in particular political knowledge, which was most esteemed, and that is the fiqh on matters of politics and public order. So there was, as you hear me say, the general point I'm trying to make, there was a kind of dual economy of political knowledge and historical knowledge. On the one hand, between an idealized and relatively abstract and unchanging Sharia on one hand, very, very rich in its own detail, but not, if you will, adjusted, indeed incapable of adjustment, like many people thought, in light of historical circumstances. On the other hand, you had the tribunals, you had the Mirs for princes, and a variety of other in less formalized political traditions, which indeed were very, very deeply engaged with the practical business of governance and learned an enormous amount, but could not, if you will, that knowledge, that historical learning could not be reflexively drawn up and back into political knowledge in Muslim society. So there was a kind of lack of the reflexive dialectic that at least political philosophers and political anthropologists like me think, or political sociologists think it's rather critical for, if you will, the refinement and reform of a political tradition in light of changes in society and historical circumstances. Now, very quickly, since our time is limited, there were, although the Sharia, and in particular the fiqh, had major gaps in its treatment of public order and government, there were three areas in which, from a contemporary human rights perspective, actually there was a surprising degree of elaboration. And this was with regards to women, non-Muslims, in particular protected Muslims, and people of the book, and then people, apostates, and/or people who were religious freethinkers, or as we say in English religious studies, nonconformists. In all three of these areas, in fact, there was a consistent differentiating tendency, a tendency to ascribe a very different package of rights to women, non-Muslims, and people who had nonconformist ideas on Islam, which I talk about in greater detail in the paper, and I'm going to just jump over these and just simply say that those three domains would be areas of special importance and special concern for advocates, supporters of Western liberal notions of human rights. And incidentally, I'm not talking about it in this paper, but I think it is very important in our conference as a whole to ask whether indeed liberal human rights are the only types of human rights, and indeed whether there is just one standard. I'm actually not advocating any single standard, although it may sound from our discussion I am. Let me now move to the second and indeed the last part of the paper, which has to do with the situation in Indonesia, having sketched out what I think is a very general sort of portrait of the status of the law and the tension of the law with the practice of politics in many Muslim societies. In the second part and the last part of the paper, I talk about the situation in Indonesia. I begin by noting something that won't surprise any of you who know any of my work, that Indonesia is, by most measures, a place where one would expect to find a broad embrace and considerable popular enthusiasm for human rights and democracy. And most historical studies have shown this. There was an enormous intellectual surge on the part of Muslim intellectuals in the 1980s and 1990s in support of constitutional democracy in the course of creating what went out was to become the largest pro-democracy movement in the Muslim world. Al Stepan correctly wants to sort of nudge that claim aside and sort of put Senegal into this kind of more pivotal position. And you did a good job today, but I'm going to still say, at least as regards pro-democracy movements, Indonesia still lays claim to the largest, and certainly in terms of impact, one of the more successful of democracy movements. It also has, notwithstanding the rise of the Jemaah Islamiyah bombers who gave us the volley bombings October 2002, and notwithstanding, I think, the far more horrific outbreak of ethno-religious violence after Suharto's fall in May 1998, a story of which is too complex to talk about here. Notwithstanding these difficult events, Indonesia has held two free and fair elections in 1999 and 2004, the overall result of which are notable for, if I could be oxymoronic, their thundering moderation. Indeed, the results of the election are a real testimony, again, to the Muslim public's embrace of democracy and its enthusiasm for parties of an overwhelmingly moderate and overwhelmingly democratic inclination. I go on in the paper to talk about, just to not provide a general account, but to talk about one of the more interesting examples of the kinds of things that have contributed to the scaling up of, I think, the beginnings of a public culture of democracy and democratic civility in Indonesia, citing the example of this program on civic education that the National Islamic University System, the UIN and IAIN, have launched, a civic education program that I actually had the pleasure of evaluating. I did research on it a few years ago and then evaluated it for the State Department. There's really nothing like it anywhere else in the world. It's an astonishing testimony, once again, to the ability of Muslim Indonesians, in this case, in the National Islamic University System, which is very big and educates upwards of about 15 to 20% of the student population. It's an example of there again, boldness and receptivity, indeed active promotion of democratic ideas. It's also important, it's also important because it's an example of just the sort of collaboration across the state-society divide that Al Stefan mentioned earlier as critical for democracy, the sort of other view that social capital in society, apart from the state, is key, I think, is a great mistake. Bob Withnow, in an article in Social Capital a few years ago, I think quite appropriately, sort of, Bob, this isn't a verb that I would normally associate with you, but he savaged those people who would do away with any kind of institutional support and research on institutional supports for democracy, and thus focus just on quote-unquote civil society and social capital. Here's an example in the Indonesian case of a collaboration across the state-society divide between state-supported Islamic institutions to scale up, again, a culture of civility and citizenship that is really rather astonishing. Now, I talk a little bit more about that in the paper, and I'm getting the 2-minute warning here, so I'm not going to say anything further about that, but just jump to some survey results that I've been doing. And I am an anthropologist by discipline, and since Charles Keyes is here and a few others, but Charles is an old friend, I sort of have to apologize in having done surveys, because every anthropologist knows you betrayed your discipline if you do surveys. These were surveys that I did after many years of ethnographic research. But they were surveys of Muslim educators, building on other surveys of the general public. And in fact, I worked with this other researcher, an Indonesian Muslim researcher, who had done public polling on Muslim attitudes towards democracy. And in my paper, which at least participants in this conference have on pages 13 through 15, I provided a brief overview of the summary of my polling for Muslim educators. I focused on that for a variety of reasons, but the critical thing again was this conviction that the scaling up across the state-society divide depends upon the attitudes and values of people like this. The results were sobering. The results were, this was a poll of 1,000 Muslim educators. I actually did a second one this year. The first one is the one that I'm talking about today. I did in January 2006, and then another one just the other day in January 2007, also 1,000 people, but a different sample. I won't give you the details. But in both cases, the results were the same, and indeed I was shocked. The polls show overwhelming support for democracy. The survey goes into very specific detail, talks about freedom of association, press freedoms, equality of the law, before the law, notwithstanding your religious background. In other words, and again, the figures are as high as you get from any part of the world, support, overwhelming Muslim educators, support for these key elements of democracy. It's not a majoritarian concept of democracy. In other words, those who are majority, they determine the public political culture. No, it goes to very, very fine-grained things that, incidentally, Norris and Engelhardt, whom I respect greatly, don't sort of explore. But it's there, it's very clear and unambiguous that the overwhelming majority of educators, like the overwhelming majority of Muslims in Indonesia, strongly endorse democracy in a non-majoritarian and very, very detailed way. If that's all there was to the story, Indonesia would indeed be a breathtaking story. But unfortunately, Muslim Indonesians' commitment to democracy doesn't stand alone. It exists against the backdrop of an equally strong commitment to, yes, the Sharia. Of course, how could it be otherwise? And the Sharia understood in a surprisingly, if I can be just too glib here, a surprisingly traditionist manner, a surprisingly conventional manner. So that by almost all measures, the support for Sharia, aspects of the Sharia, is just about as strong as for democracy. So that about 75% of Muslim respondents say yes, the state should be based on the Quran and Sunnah. This is after 84% who said they believe that democracy was the best form of government for Indonesia. And it goes down the line. There's only a little bit of hesitation or wobble when we get to things like cutting off thieves' hands, where the figures drop from the high 70s down to the high 40s and low 50s, but that's still a majority. The figures get, from a political citizenship and democracy perspective, the figures get equally worrying when one goes to questions about women, minorities, and apostates, or in general nonconformists. And here too, I won't give you the breakdown, I don't have time. Here too, the figures are very, very sobering, suggesting that when the Sharia provides a clear message, or at least is interpreted as providing a clear message on how Muslims should deal with women as leaders, with non-Muslims, and with non-conformists who, if you will, flout the standards of the Sharia, of God's law. The position is unequivocally other than that which a modern human rights, liberal human rights understandings of human rights would typically imply. Conclusion, I can't go into that in full detail, but what by way of conclusion can I draw? I think what we see in the Indonesian data that I've talked about here, and the reason I preface it, of course, with the discussion of the Sharia historically, is we see the tip of what really is a very broad iceberg. And it's in Muslim public opinion. And it's an iceberg which Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris studies, again, very good studies, researchers whom I respect enormously, don't get at, because they stick at a very simple level as to what democracy is. Their questions on democracy are very broadly cast, and then don't get into Islam-specific questions. And it's when one gets into Islam-specific questions that one sees not so much a contradiction, I don't think it is a contradiction, but a very, very serious unresolved tension, a lack of integration between that, on one hand, high and unambiguous commitment to democracy, which we see in many, not just Indonesia, but many Muslim majority countries. Tension between that on one hand, and then those aspects of fiqh, or the historical Sharia, that deal in particular with women and non-Muslims and questions of religious freedom. What we see here is a problem that Khalid Abu al-Fadel and Abdul Khadim Saloush and a variety of other political reformers in Islam have pointed to as well. That is that human rights issues are going to be the subject of much debate and controversy for much time to come, until that point, as there is some type of systematic intellectual and public cultural reformation of the tradition, that it reaches into ulama and fuqaha, scholarly circles. I'm done? Okay, well,
Finish that sentence.
Finish that sentence. This reflects the fact that I think of something that we have to take into consideration, which I think is a dimension of democratization and the creation of a public culture of human rights in the Muslim world that's going to be and will remain quite different from that which we associate with those twin phenomena, related phenomena in the West. That is a kind of nested phenomenon. Islam doesn't have a church, of course, but it does have jurists and it does have religious scholars, not centralized in a kind of ecclesiastical structure, but it is a nested organization which exercises a great influence, greatly disproportionate to its actual numbers in society, and it will continue to do so at least as long as a good number of Muslims continue to take the Sharia seriously. It, again, is hard to imagine otherwise. What this means in terms of politics, finally, in just my last 2 sentences, is that I don't think we're looking at, if you will, a clash of civilization sort of conflict like some people say, I think, and not least of all, have forecast. We're instead looking at something much closer to that which sociologists of public culture, political culture, and religion in America have long recognized: culture wars. The Muslim world, rather than sort of being just at the first phase of democratization, is really in the early phases of a new way of developing public culture, and a public political culture, one in which well-organized constituencies, which historically didn't have a place in the formation of public dialogues and public policy, are now, whether through invitation or through their own initiative, pressing to exercise a much greater influence on public culture and public issues. That's what, after all, happened in the United States with evangelicals and others. And it's a process that we associate with not so much non-democracy, but the maturation of a democracy and more participatory political systems. Generally, political systems that allow for the incorporation of a broader assortment of voices than the rule of experts and rulers alone. So culture wars are going to be a major part of the human rights and democracy agenda in the Muslim world. We're in the early phases of that, but it's precisely because of that, I think, that, and the threat that that posed, if not handled correctly, that makes me, for the most part, quite optimistic about democratization in the Muslim world, because as Abdul Karim Saroush and others have pointed out, the greatest threat, the greatest threat to religion itself is that this process of public discussion of Islam is itself hijacked by small groups of cadres rather than, if you will, subjected to a much more procedurally public and accountable system of discussion. Anyway, thank you.
Certainly we could go on about all these topics for a long time, and there will be plenty of time for discussion. I would just like to frame my response by referring to a single concept within the heritage of Muslim political thought, namely siyasa, because I think it'll help us think about all the issues that have been raised here today. So there's this thing called siyasa in Islam, state governance, state institutions, and as well alongside Sharia, the law of God. There can be overlap, and over the centuries and even today, there's been attempts to siyasify Sharia or Shariafy siyasa. But in general, the two realms, siyasa and Sharia, are separate. And siyasa is man-made, it's not revealed. It is important, but it's not essential to the venture of Islam, whereas Sharia is essential. So, there's debate over the content of Sharia, as Bob has mentioned. But it was seen as something which people could have autonomy from. So there is no possibility of autonomy from Sharia, but there is the possibility of autonomy from siyasa that is unjust and arbitrary. So siyasa is the place where the concept of human autonomy in Islam can be grounded. There is ample room in Islam for political liberty, autonomy vis-a-vis siyasa as the basis of democratic sentiment. And Bob has gotten into some of these points in his presentation, but not for moral liberty, that is autonomy vis-a-vis Sharia. So I think this concept can help us understand these three areas that have been discussed. Bob notes rightly an apparent contradiction. The coexistence of democratic sentiment and Sharia supremacy in Indonesia. And I think we can understand this if we refer to the siyasa-Sharia complex. One has autonomy against siyasa, but not against Sharia. And it is clear, therefore, that we need to think a lot more about the nature of religion in Islam. To see how it is in places like Indonesia, there can be democratization, where all have a say in siyasa, that is, a political voice, while at the same time, there is a desire to preserve Sharia set boundaries. Now, of course, there's still the challenge of non-Muslim minorities in such a context. But as Bob has noted, we're extremely ignorant of the internal logic of Sharia. For example, included in the notion of the rights of God is the duty of siyasa, the state, to ensure the public good, which can even trump, when necessary, Sharia precedent. And there are examples, not only in Indonesia, but elsewhere, such as Lebanon, where Muslim movements have, on the basis of Sharia principles, chosen to forego Sharia supremacy at the national level when it conflicts with the harmony that is the public good of a religiously pluralistic nation. A similar siyasa-sharia dynamic is at play in Yvonne's observations on the logic of Muslim feminism, and I'm going to refer to some things in her paper that we didn't have time to explore. But the goal of Muslim feminism is not rejection of the veil or demand for sexual liberties outside marriage, but political equality, siyasa equality alongside Sharia morality. Now, it should be remembered that rights are never given, but they must be struggled for, and that's something we know from our own American history. And Muslim women have been actively participating in the so-called awakening in contemporary Islam, a sahwa, especially its place in the public sphere. And they expect their male counterparts to recognize that in the form of liberties for women in the public sphere as a result of their role in the struggle for Islam. For example, Zainab al-Ghazali, she is prime exemplar of that, founder of the Muslim Women's Association in Egypt. But one can also point to women in the Islamic Revolution in Iran who took an active part, and also Muslim women in Turkey who've taken an important part in the ongoing contestation over the national identity in Turkey between a secular state and a Muslim society. So such women, in the name of Islam, the promotion of which they have struggled in the siyasa sphere, the struggle for Islam in the siyasa sphere, they do not intend to return to traditional definitions of womanhood after they've struggled. And they've been disappointed when their male counterparts expect them to. So these women are not challenging Sharia morality, but they want political liberties as well as legal equality. Now, legal equality is a little more difficult because it depends whether we're talking about equality before siyasa law or before Sharia law. And one can see this, for example, in the Iranian feminist journal Zanan, but also in the outlook, for example, of Hidayat Tuksal, professor in the theology faculty at Ankara University. They're wanting political liberties, but within a respect for Sharia law. So we can start to see how Islam has an internal logic of rights of its own. So the problem is not rights per se, but rather the conceptualization of the human being, not simply as politically autonomous, but also morally autonomous, that often accompanies secular-based human rights talk, and that Muslims, as well as Christians, as I see it, find troubling. Humans have rights, but so does God. And yet, this dual system of rights can cause friction, but only when states assume jurisdiction over the rights of God. Kenneth Roth mentioned last night a tension between the communitarian vision of the human being and individual rights. I think that needs to be nuanced. It's not a community's values per se that pose a problem to those who dissent from them, but rather when a state decides that it has jurisdiction over a community's values, especially communities that are transnational in nature. And when states do that in the name of a national identity, a state-defined national identity over against a community's transnational identity. And here we get to Riva's important remarks on state-defined national projects, which, whether they're secular or religious, they often seek legitimacy by claiming the right to liberate or protect women, making the female body the locus of tension between intranational and extranational views of identity. So at this globalizing, transnationalizing, cross-nationalizing, denationalizing moment, we are witnessing a crisis in the concept of the nation state, and yet it is still at the level of national courts that questions of human rights are negotiated and that acceptable religiosity within the parameters of national identity is defined. This is strikingly obvious in the case of Euro-Muslims, whose minority status exacerbates the tension between siyasa-defined identity and Sharia-defined identity, with all kinds of confusion and conflation taking place between the two. And yet a similar tension can be noticed elsewhere, making it important for us to start to think about a typology of national identities and their ability to accommodate or not the extranational identity of religious minorities. France may define its public identity in terms of laïcité, requiring elimination of all ostentatious displays of religiosity in state institutions, But some states in Germany, for example, such as Baden-Württemberg or Bayern, Bavaria, they also restrict the Muslim veil, but they don't restrict Christian symbols in state institutions. There, public identity is not keyed to laicite, but to a cultural heritage that acknowledges Christianity to the exclusion of other religions. In Italy, to take another example, it was decided to keep crucifixes in state institutions, including courts, not for theological considerations, but as a part of the nation's cultural heritage. However, unlike the German Länder, Italy opted for accommodation alongside the public privileging of Christian symbols, allowing the Muslim veil into the state environment. So, what I see is a tension that might be obvious in France, but it's at play in all nations, including Muslim-majority ones. And there you find a tension between state-defined national identity and other identities that is involving not only non-Muslim, but also Muslim minorities, who might not fit into the religiosity deemed acceptable by the state, such as Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia or Sunnism in Pakistan. But this is also true when the Muslim-majority nations have a state that defines its identity against Islam, such as Turkey and Uzbekistan. The fact is that the state in the modern context plays a key role in defining acceptable religiosity in the public sphere, and that's a challenge to the rights of God from the Muslim perspective, as well as to religious freedom from the human rights perspective. So we still have a long way to go towards understanding a way out of this tension between national identity and a sense of transnational, even otherworldly belonging, both of which show no signs of disappearing. So my question, I guess, is for the panel, and then we can open it up for discussion, is how do we understand Islam? Because I think that's important in order to help us understand the political events we see on the ground. Is it a group identity in a political sense defined against other identities, or is it a religious consciousness with a organic vision of its own? So on that, I will again follow the precedent set this morning, and if we could take 2 or 3 questions and then have them answered.
Hi, thank you all very much. My name is Captain Kraft, and I have a question that for Professor Haddad. I really resonated with your explanation of how international relations have affected what's happened in the Arab world. It resonates a lot with what I've studied, and I want to ask a question that is probably a very unacademic question, but I still want to ask and just wonder how you'll respond to it. And I'm just wondering if you've ever really thought about, had those things not happened, what would human rights in the Arab world be like now?
Let's take 2 more questions.
I'm Liz Duker, for people who don't know me. I'm a postdoc fellow at the Berkley Center. I have 2 questions. I'll make them both really short, though. One is very practical, one is more theoretical, just so that those who know me, that's sort of my thing. First question for Robert Heckner. Where you started your talk is sort of where I am, sort of trying to think about alternatives to liberal conceptions of human rights. But then where you ended your talk was sort of where I think I'm trying to work against. And I'm wondering if this sort of, what did you call it, this worrying sort of interest in the Sharia with democracy in Indonesia is not maybe more of an opportunity for sort of thinking about non-liberal or Islamic sort of conceptions of human rights, and if this unresolvable tension, which of course we can see in our own administration, sort of work in Iraq, sort of going to Iraq to save human rights, but then detaining people in ways that would sort of violate human rights. If this unresolvable tension is maybe a place where the innovation happens, the creativity happens, and maybe there's something there to learn for liberal conceptions of human rights, probably less liberal Islamic conceptions. And then my theoretical question is actually for Paul Heck. It's always surprising to me that sometimes respondents, that it's almost like I'm going to pick on the panel, so thank you for your great response, Paul. Which is that I very much like this siyasa Sharia distinction. I think that's fine. I think it helps put the three papers into context. One question I sort of had was that you sort of put autonomy in the siyasa and sort of implied that heteronomy would be then in Sharia. I wonder if there's a way to maybe complicate that, where that there are heteronymous conceptions as well in siyasa in terms of the common good, as well as autonomous conceptions in Sharia. So if you're in a place in terms of using ijtihad, or if you follow ijtihad, which ijtihad to follow, and sort of picking advice, and if there's actually a way to think about autonomy to some degree in that context as well.
Here's one more. And then
I think it's very important that we do not think so much of Islamic or Muslim exceptionalism in these matters. You, Paul, herself referred to these tensions as still existing within the Christian tradition, but certainly if I look at my own religious tradition, Catholicism, you find the greatest metamorphosis. For 150 years, the discourse of human rights was attacked as being evil, as being against the laws of God, and against the interests of the church. And then you find the popes defining themselves as the great defenders of human rights around the world. Something very radically happens. But those human rights are not legitimated theologically on liberal grounds. So they have found a theological way of assuming a discourse of human rights which is non-liberal. This is not the autonomy. Again, you have the tension, the same tension you've mentioned between Siyasa and Sharia, of course, because the whole tension between political Catholicism, the neutrality vis-a-vis political regimes, and dogma and religious matters. But you have the same tension still today. The Catholic Church today affirms both the freedom of conscience and dogma. And it is up to everybody to find out how this tension is resolved. So the point is that those are not unique Islamic. It's a particular version, the Islamic one, but it's very important that we saw them in a much broader general context.
why don't we get some answers now? Yvonne, do you want to?
That was Jose Casanova. I'm sorry.
It's very hard to predict. I'm a historian, and so I'm not a political scientist like everybody else, predicting the future rather than the past. But basically, the secular and the socialist groups, both the nationalists and the socialists were secular, and now we have a division between the secular and the Islamists. There's absolutely no question, and both sometimes collaborate on the idea of women's rights, and they want to change them. But we have moved specifically into Islamic discourse. So even by the 80s, you have Mernissi shifting from trying to confront the Muslim hierarchy into trying to study the Islamic sources and trying to find a space and a place for Muslim women's rights within Islam itself. And this has taken several ways. I mean, there's a whole group of scholars working on this within the Muslim community. You have people working on history, trying to prove from history that women were very important and very active in public space. You have the mothers of the believers, the wives of the Prophet Muhammad, whose lives are reinvented and have become sort of very important as warriors, as scholars, and as business women. Each woman, each wife, becomes a model for a profession. But then you have some people looking at Egyptian history, for example, and seeing that women were in public space, and women in Nigeria and some other places who are the business people. So you don't confine women to space. But what has happened is that since the 1990s, the pressure of Islamization started in the 70s, probably the 60s, part of the Islamic fact, which is Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Morocco, who are working to spread Islam, encouraged by the United States government, as a way to put a brake on the spread of communism and Marxism and socialism in the Arab world. And the Saudi influence has made it imperative that if you're going to have anybody within the Muslim hierarchy, this will be within Islam. And what we have is very interesting. It's in the public interest of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. They have, you have Al-Azhar come out with a 6-volume study showing that the hadith of the Prophet has been invented. Anything anti-women is invented. And so they have identified good hadith which liberates women, and they have to vote. And this is why in Jordan and Egypt, when they vote, the Muslim Brotherhood gets more votes, and so it becomes extremely important for them. So they manipulate this stuff, whether it's siyasa or not. They can play with it as also as jurisprudence, fiqh, and they distinguish it what is fiqh and sharia. But that is contested, and you see that a lot of women now ask that we work with the jurisprudence and reinterpret the law, the sharia itself, and they're having trouble with that because we have several people have been called apostates because they have made that distinction. And the sharia has become extremely important because they see that the West wants to abolish the sharia. So the more the West would say sharia is awful, the more it becomes very important to hang on to. And then the last bastion of women, the women who are really trying very hard, and some of them are seculars, they're looking at the Quran itself to find equality for women, liberation for women in the Quran. And they see it in theological terms, either in the justice of God, or the idea that women and men were created from one cell, or more recently, the idea that when God said to Adam, he said to the angels, I'm going to create Adam, make Adam vice-chairman on earth. And that wasn't to Adam, he said, I'm going to put the Khalifa. And that Khalifa, vice-chairman, is the human being who's going to create culture, is both male and female. So they're grounding it in creation. And this is the new theology that's coming, feminist theology from within Islam.
Bob, maybe you could respond to this question.
It was a great question about the looking at the tension. I hope I didn't give the impression that it's an unresolvable tension. It's in the sense that it's a problem. It's in fact just a tension like those which run through all pluralist civilizations, but one that gives rise to, just as you suggest, and I strongly agree with you, an opportunity to think about alternative conceptions of human rights. This makes many people very nervous. It makes me nervous. It makes many of my Muslim democratic friends extremely nervous. I have spoken with Muslim intellectuals from Syria, from Egypt, but especially from Malaysia and Indonesia, who again and again come back, and to just sort of summarize, they come back to one theme. If we open up this Pandora's box, anything is going to go. We've got to keep with one standard. We're not assuming that it is a standard that was set for all time, and we're certainly not assuming that it is a Western creation or it requires Judeo-Christian values, as some people have argued. We think it is simply procedurally correct and most efficacious at present. So there's a lot of anxiety out there, and it's an anxiety that obviously Muslims themselves are going to have to resolve in whatever ways that they devise, and I think that they will devise different answers, but by different answers within their own framework and within different countries. What I was suggesting, however, a couple of things that I think will remain distinctive. First is, and Paul referred to this as well, I think, if I understood his comment correctly, I think the question of public virtue is going to remain far more central, and at least in its post-60s understanding and its Rawlsian understanding, it's going to not be managed in a way in many Muslim societies that is compatible with, or at least directly consonant with, a kind of Rawlsian and individual autonomy approach to public virtue, commanding right and forbidding wrong, being not merely a slogan of Islamic jurists. It actually is something that has considerable cultural support based on the surveys that I've been involved with and some other agencies have been involved with. It's something that has public cultural legs. Now, all that said, when we think about, and this goes back to Jose's, I think, quite correct point, when we think about the Muslim world, we shouldn't, and this issue in particular, we shouldn't sort of fall into an easy Islamic exceptionalism. If we take Rawls as our sort of barometer of where democratic values came from in the West, I think we're lost, and we lose sight of much of the own richness and pluralism that obtains within Western political tradition. I think if we go back to Bob Wuthnow's book on the 1988 book, what was the title, The Restructuring of American Religion, which I think starts with a nice sort of vignette. It was a Brooklyn neighborhood where, was it some type of parade, and it was a religious parade. It was sponsored, and as I remember it, funded, or at least at the very least, it was sponsored by a civic association. This was the way in which religion was operationalized in American society, I think in many communities for most of American history. As Al reminded us this morning, all of the great Nordic democracies had state churches. So this sort of issue, not just of state, society, and church and state relations, or mosque and state relations, but the whole question of whether the state should be involved in supporting religion, and in particular, supporting public virtue, I think is likely to remain a much more central issue in most Muslim democracies and most Muslim polities generally for a long time to come. It's not merely because of jurisprudence, but because I think of broader cultural trends in Muslim society. I guess Charles Taylor would say, well, it's a civic republican tradition, and in a certain way it is, and reminding ourselves of that fact helps us to sort of abide by Jose's counsel, that we not sort of understand the historical reality of Western political democracy merely in terms of the way it's been presented by certain political philosophers, particularly those who don't draw heavily on the actual historical practice of Western politics, rather than just a kind of sui generis analysis. Final point, and this goes back also to your question, which is that I guess my ending, because I ran out of time, is too abrupt. But what I was suggesting, what I was trying to suggest, is that the values of democracy that are most likely to take hold, and I think that are taking hold very, very vigorously, with some notable, striking exceptions, not least of all those that Al talked about this morning, have to do with procedural democracy. And I think the future for procedural democracy in societies that achieve that kind of balance of social forces in society, that the old civil society literature that of the Weberian sort used to talk about, where you have checks on the power of any single group, and out of that sort of checked circumstance you get pacts and deals. Those situations of those sorts are emerging or developing in much of the Muslim world. A second point from that, and they will support, I think, a turn toward procedural democracy, but not perhaps liberal understandings of virtue, or whether the state should be involved in or not involved in the cultivation of virtue. Which is to say, I think, as I again said too abruptly at the end, I think we're in the early phases, not the late phases, of a very interesting participatory development in Muslim polities around the world. Whether we want to call it democracy or not depends upon our democracy, our definition of democracy. It also depends upon the country in question. There can be little doubt that there is a heightened pattern of public participation in political issues and cultural issues around the world. And this, while it may be good for democracy, is also going to intensify in some ways debates over precisely what the cultural substance of public culture and public polity should be. So I think we're going to see culture wars in the Muslim world, just as we see in our own societies for the indefinite future. That's natural and indeed a hopefully welcome part of the more participatory public order.
Great. I know Riva would like to make some comments here, so.
I would like just to add to what Jose said about we shouldn't take Islam as practically about other religions. So if I transpose this comment on a state level, I would say the state shouldn't take any particularistic view on such and such and such religion. So that's maybe one of the understanding of this constitutional setting of secularism and state control of religion, rather than you state financing religions and promoting any kind of interaction, but state controlling religion, then taking out all the religious aspect and put it into institution where all religions are recognized on the same level. So not recognize what Islam has a specific in this recognition, but have the same kind of representation on equality with other kinds of religions. So this, in some ways, this understanding of institutional accommodation of secularism can help to understand, can maybe lead to this to the reverse question, to the reverse aspect of your question, where state doesn't deal with religion in the same terms as culture, but as religious secular state and French state. And the French laicite, understanding of laicite. Just to your reaction in Germany, for example, there's another understanding of secularism in Germany. In Germany, the religion comes out from a public law. So the whole question of Islam in Germany is the recognition of Islam. So far, Islam doesn't have an institutional recognition as other religions. So what are the recognition in Germany of religion? Is it instruction in public schools? So if you have a cross in a public school in Bulgaria, mainly, you wouldn't have any Islamic, you don't have Islamic teaching. Therefore, there is no recognition of Islam on the same level as other religions in the public law level. So it's not a matter of culture there, it's a matter of religion. So these are the two different aspects. And if I may say something also, I think we have unequal part of word in this panel, but if I may say something on the way we put the tension between state and transnational, that's true. It's not that national identity wants to shape all the transnational identities, but it's the control of the state on its own minority in some ways, a religious minority, where it has the allegiances and belonging, or also just networks on a transnational level. So of course this tension is because we are still at the age of nation state and state controlling its boundaries and controlling the identities expressed within its boundaries, and that's why that is also maybe one of the understanding of the French laicite's attitude that is perceived as a very oppressive way on the banning the scarf is how to, and also on institutional representation, how to avoid these transnational forces penetrating into or being out of the control of the state. So this is the real question of the nation state is really today how to deal this tension of transnationalism, where these transnational values or attitudes or identities are in the society and a part of citizenship values also.
Great. We're at 3:15. Can we take a couple more questions? Yeah. Liz, I'm going to respond to your questions afterwards. Al, yeah.
A specific question for Robert. The data of elections, strongly democratic, and then the things related to Islam raise all sorts of issues and problems. Did you ask any question about Pankasina, the 5 principles? Because I think William Little did at one time, and what came out then, that was 5 years ago, was a lot of people were involved in internally contradictory statements about it, because in fact, when they saw it as Pankasina, they totally accepted it. And not totally, but heavily accepted it, whereas they would deny it in their capacity as a religious leader. Did you probe that dimension of really artful and deliberate inconsistency?
That's a very fine way of putting it.
If we could just take one more question first.
And possibly useful.
We have one up front here.
One question for me.
Sorry. Rita just raised an interesting point that I thought that should be followed through, which we haven't really sort of taken up, and that is the role of schools. I mean, you talked about schools, but we need to talk about, and this comes back to this tension between the state and Sharia. What about public schools? How do public schools exist in Islamic countries?
All right, well, why don't you
Briefly, I think on both questions, Al, it's a great question. I didn't ask specifically about the Panchasila or the 5 principles, which historically were, and indeed still are, the official ideological basis of the Indonesian state. What our survey did do, however, and maybe this was a mistake, was try to break down those principles into various general categories. And we probably should have also asked something about the Panchasila, but we didn't. All that said, there is a Panchasila revival taking place right now, and as is so often the case in Muslim Indonesia. It's Muslim intellectuals who are leading the way. And they're trying to reinterpret the 5 principles in such a way as to emphasize again the reality of Indonesia as a plural state. Briefly on public schools in Muslim majority countries are all over the map as regards to both how the public school system works and then how the Islamic school system works. There's a variety of general patterns, but the interesting trend in most of the Muslim world, there's some exceptions, is that in most of the world over the last 20 years, in the case of Southeast Asia, and in particular Southeast Asia, it's been over the last 70 years, the Muslim schools themselves, on their own initiative, have heightened the proportion of general educational materials in their curriculum, so that today, in fact, it's about 70%, 65 to 70% in Indonesia. But the same pattern has taken place, interestingly, in parts of Southeast Asia with very, very different political profiles, such as in the madrasas tradition in southern Thailand, where there's been an upping of, yes, there has. We just did a project on that. Absolutely. It's quite dramatic. It has, of course, refused the Buddhist curriculum that the state wanted to insert. But that's a trend that's being driven by 2 things. I'll finish here. By 2 things. Both of the Muslim world.
Al, did you have a question for Riva?
Yes, Riva's paper, she didn't have a chance to allude to it, but it was fascinating. You talked about the countries of origin sending.
Riva's paper on page 13 and page 5. It is fascinating because this laissez-faire state feels most comfortable in dealing with other states to some extent. But this leads to this rather strange environment, strange outcome that they sign contracts with other states to send preachers. Now, many of these contracts, these bilateral agreements, are implied with Algeria, which would be, it is not exactly the center of liberal Islam. So, and then also, they also accepted agreements with political parties, and you mentioned peace. So this, you would think for a democratic state to going into, or did I misinterpret what you wrote?
I think so. But go ahead. I'll tell you.
No, I want to.
Go ahead.
Well, you do talk about this negotiation, that you're dealing with other, the difficulty of representation. Does the French state feel uncomfortable with people organizing themselves into lots of different groups and interest groups around religion or ethnicity and so on? And it's against the law to have affirmative action, and it's against the law to ask these questions. But my question was really driven by this. Are these bilateral agreements to send imams, are they really with states? And Senegal would be appalled by this, that they're sending in preachers. I mean, do they really need imams from Algeria?
Yes, no, this bilateral agreement with France is not with priests or not with imams. It's with with teachers for foreign language, for language of origin. Then, with the Algerian story, the Arab language was used afterwards in extracurricular classes for religious classes. So, but of course, it's not an official agreement, but the state knows about it. So the whole waking up with the scarf issue was all around this too. The scarf issue was not new, but it was awakening after all what is being penetrated into the classroom through this FIS representative as language teacher but Quran teacher. It's not state bilateral agreement, it's not official, it's the use of these exchanges for religious purposes. The same thing for Turkey. Turkey is a secular state. The language agreement didn't send imams, of course. Imams were brought by communities, local communities, people getting together, etc. So with the demand of the families in public school, in French public schools, these teachers have become also a sort of local imam. So there's a whole use of the community, local and larger, later on national, and even national community, took over the role of, changed the role of these official figures into a religion. So it's not a state, democratic state, that will recognize the feast as an intermediary, but this official state will recognize the fundamentalist, radical Islamic movements in France as an intermediary to represent the Muslim French representative institution. And this is because of the representation of this Islamic movement within the Muslims in France that has become, with a very strange electoral system within the representation done by Sarkozy, as you know, that brought this radical Islamic movements in the representation of Islam. And then I argue on this, on the Islamic institutional assimilation, that saying if you bring all this representation into a national institutional representation, that is the CFCM in France, maybe we can get to an identification with the French institutional and French state understanding of religion and break with the countries of origin and with the transnational understanding of this Islam that I bring into nationalism. Just for religious schools, for secular schools, of course I'm talking about secular schools, I don't know any public schools in any Muslim society, even the Muslim society I grew up in was a secular state, is. So it's much more, the tension in the public school in France that brought this whole issue of the headscarf is this, the pious families and Muslim pious families, or families that were much more inclined to follow the imam than the secular teacher, the secular public space. So the whole tension, like in these areas, were like in competition, the law of Quranic, quote unquote, and the law of the republic in competition within the school and within the neighborhood. And these are related to the guys, to the imams who came with the feast, or Mini Gerush, or all these kind of movements that developed in Europe, and they kept the ties, and these ties were used in religiosity in Europe.
Okay, I think Yvonne would like to make one quick comment.
Just one thing, and part of the agreements with bringing in foreign imams was the idea that the Muslim immigration was labor migration, and that all these people were going to go back. And the whole idea was to teach them Turkish, so they had an agreement with the state of Turkey to bring imams in, and they taught them allegiance to Turkey. Now, the whole idea that these were never going to be Dutch citizens or Belgian citizens or Danish citizens.
Right. Go ahead.
But then they changed their mind, and they're stuck with it.
They didn't change it, just for this very precision. With Germany and Turkey, they have this bilateral agreement with language, with everything, and not imams. But the demand of Islam of Muslim population brought, of course, religion at the core. And Turkey, as a secular state, didn't have any imams sent to abroad. But in 1981, the Turkish secular state established in every consulate a religious affairs. So in these religious affairs, sent imams to every neighborhood where you had a concentration of Turks all over Europe. And of course, all the states knew that, and all the local authorities knew that, because it's the representation of Turkey, and not an agreement with France or Germany or Netherlands. It's a representation of Turkey, like any consul, but religious leaders.
Okay, I think we're going to have to bring this panel to a close. There will be coffee and other goodies during the break. We'll reconvene at 3:45, but please join me